Thanks very much. Oh, I think I need the clicker. Here it is. Disclosures, have a couple, but nothing too exciting, I don't think. This is some of the work I've done. I want to acknowledge parts of my group who are here, Sarah Gurka and Carmel Shahar, who work with me on some of this funded research. Okay, we've heard a lot about the sunshine so far, I would say. What Sarah Palin might have said, that hopey, changey stuff, as she put it, right? This idea that we're going to have all these interventions that are positive, going to change the world, going to be great. And of course, I'm a lawyer and an ethicist, so I bring the clouds and sometimes the rain to the table. But I think we have to think about the clouds and the rain when we're talking about this. So this is my slide about how you build machine learning algorithms and all the ethical and legal issues you face when you do so. It's a little bit like me, who doesn't build these. It's a little bit like a poet discussing with a mechanic how the car works. So think about this a little bit like my ode to the carburetor, if you will. But in terms of breaking down the pieces, this is the way I think about it. So at the broadest level, you have to start by acquiring the data. And that's not something we've talked a lot about yet today. How do you do this? Do patients need to be explicitly consented for the use of their clinical data? If, as we heard earlier, there is no such thing as de-identified data, only various forms of de-identification or degrees of it, to what extent does that act as a salve? Do we need explicit consent? Can it be broad, general consent? Can it be front door consent when you accept services or the first time you go to a hospital? Do most of us know whether we've consented to the use of our EHR data and for what purposes at this moment? If I took a poll in this room, how representative is the data we're talking about? If racial and other minorities are left out, how will that affect the model in ways that might benefit or more likely disfavor some of these models? We've seen this in policing. To what extent can you do statistical correction on the back end? To what extent do you know if your model is biased before you've deployed it in real-world settings? We haven't talked a lot about patients and their governance and their rights here. To what extent should patients be involved in deciding what happens with their data? There's a lot of wonderful things we want to do with the data. Do patients have a necessary voice, and how do we empower that form of governance? Should we think about this as like a union of patients who control rights over their data, or maybe a trust with a fiduciary? How can this become meaningful rather than merely window dressing? Okay, you've acquired your data. Now you're building and validating your model. How do you know when your model works well enough to actually be deployed on real patients? Do we envisage that there's going to be a risk classification here with different levels of demandingness depending on the risk of the intervention? Can we know ahead of time about possible cascade effects? And here there's a really interesting, I think, trade-off between intellectual property on the one hand and what would be desirable, which would be transparency, auditing, openness. And this stems from the fact that both in the US and in the EU, it's extremely hard to patent the underlying algorithm. As a result, your business strategy is to try to lock up things with either trade secrecy and also try to silo the data. That is exactly the opposite of what you want if you're trying to have a transparent, open science movement. To what extent do we need to rethink the intellectual property rules here? Phase 3, testing the model in real-world settings. You've got a model that you're pretty confident in, and now you want to use it on real patients. To what extent do patients need to be explicitly consented to the fact that a model is being deployed first in humans with them? Does there need to be a separate informed consent? Should there be some form of opt-out? What about cases when the analytics is steering resource allocation, which will typically be the case in global health settings? To what extent might you worry that patients are strategically going to opt in or opt out in this way? What about when it is invisible what the model is doing? For example, allocating physician or nurse time. Do we tend to think that patients have a role to play in deciding when to consent to various forms of workflow, for example? Is this very much like computer decision aids, where most of us don't know that our physicians are using them, there's no explicit conversation, or is the exception of AI quite different here? What forms of choice architecture, nudges, and the like are appropriate? Okay, you've done all that, now you've got broad dissemination. First question, what happens when something goes wrong? Who pays for the liability? How is the liability allocated between the physician who uses it, the hospital system or government that buys it, and the maker of the algorithm? We could have everything from, I would say, from medical malpractice on the one hand to a vaccine compensation fund structure on another to something like an FDA pre-approval process. When you have a model that works that costs money, who pays for it? Is it the fact that this model is going to be based on the data of thousands or millions or hundreds of millions of patients, but many of those patients never see the benefit of that model if it is a for-profit institution? Are there obligations for graduated licensing here or the like? And lastly, the one more diagram. This is my iceberg of data privacy. And it's an iceberg because we typically think about what we care about for healthcare data as the stuff above the water. That's what's protected by HIPAA in the United States, healthcare data. But the reality is, in the future, most of the inferences we make about people's health, about their lives, will be generated between that which is below the water. Here in the United States, we don't view things like Fitbit data, social media data, your pharmacy sometimes, masseuses, for example. All of these things are Google searches. We don't think about that as health data. But in reality, it is health data. We have to think seriously whether we only want to protect the stuff above the water and ignore everything below the water. These are the funders. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your talk. Do you think that following the path that Europe is taking with GDPR is a solution?
It's tough, right? So GDPR was a general, as the name suggests, general data privacy regulation, right? That means it was with the goal, what they were thinking about was not healthcare, right? On the other hand, in the United States, we have a very different approach. Our approach is sectoral, so we're looking at healthcare data, but it's also custodian specific, in that it is healthcare data generated of certain kinds, generated by a covered entity or a business associate. Pretty confident that the US approach is too narrow, in that if we really are heading to a future where most of the things that are going to tell us about people's health are not in healthcare records controlled by covered entity, it doesn't make sense to only focus on that. On the other hand, I will tell you, and I talk to lots of people around the world, GDPR is creating huge headaches and heartburn. And not the headaches and heartburn it was intended to produce, but unintended heartburn and headaches for the medical community, because it turns out what we want to do with healthcare data and the nature of healthcare data is a little bit different. So I would appreciate to loosen a little bit, not have this heavily custodian-specific approach of HIPAA, but at the same time, I think the generalness of a GDPR is not a great solution either.
Thank you very much. Just like Anne said during the keynote address, that if we use data sets that exclude a specific population, then we will be introducing biases. But I'm looking at not the bias aspect, but imagine that most of the data, the work that is being done will be used in developing countries, but very little of this data comes from developing countries, when especially in imagery, most of the X-ray and films are taken in different parts of the world. And now, ethically, is it possible to draw a thin line when these researchers are, testing the validation of their product and when they are actually trying to, offer help or to provide health care in this rural population? At what point do we detect that they are actually still at the phase of testing the validity of their product? And just like in clinical trials, where I've participated in review boards for clinical research, do we have the institutional framework that is capable and trained yet to be able to carry out review for AI products that are yet to be used? And is that capacity really there? Because we need to already think about review boards that will have the capacity to be able to protect human subjects that will be involved in this phase of testing the validity of AI products.
Great, there's a lot there, so let me just pick out 3 pieces of it. The first piece is, in not this gathering, but most gatherings about AI and healthcare, the excitement is about the cutting edge. What can we do? How can we take our excellent doctors at our excellent academic medical centers and make them even better? In reality, the big value proposition is actually about the democratization of expertise. Is taking the excellent doctors we have and making what they do now, very well to be clear, available much more broadly. And I think that is particularly something to keep a focus on. Second point about the question about the lack of people from the developing world in some data sets, right, and how that plays out. So my colleagues who do the AI design, who are not the poets like me, I will defer to them to how well or badly we can retrain existing algorithms on new data sets. But to do that assumes that you have a new data set that's representative of the developing population, and you have the financing in order to do that. And one of the questions will be is whether we're going to see digital haves and have-nots here, in that these algorithms are being built for academic medical centers and their typical patients, and not for people in the developing world, right? And the last thing I just want to touch on is this question about expertise, randomized clinical trials, IRBs, and the like. And here's kind of, I think, the problem. This was alluded to a little bit earlier by one of the other speakers. You've got FDA in the United States, but typically EMA, the other regulators, who are very good on drugs and devices. They have people who've been trained on this, they've learned about this, they have a pathway for this. They've traditionally been fairly allergic to software. They've traditionally said, we don't do software, software is not us. They're now coming around a little bit here, at least in the United States, and they're being more open to it. But the problem is the time frame on which you do drug development, and the time frame in which you do drug validation, and the time frame in which you gather the data is radically different from the time frame in which you want to do an AI development. Because when a drug is on the market, the last thing you want to do until your patent is about to expire is touch it, right? You want to leave it the way it is. You don't want to learn a lot more about it for the most part. With an AI and this image of the learning healthcare system, we're constantly learning. We want to constantly be able to update and change and the like. And that's just a real paradigm shift for a regulator that's used to looking at things in a snapshot. So I think we're actually going to encounter some difficulties, even for regulators who are well-intentioned, in terms of their skills and their ability to do this. Thank you very much.